How you doing there? Welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Mem Tes, Daf 49 of Masechta, Avodah Zarah. Friends, friends, hey, friends. Today we are finishing the third perek of Masechta Avodah Zarah. Very exciting. There's 5 prakim in Masechta Avodah Zarah. At the end of today's daf, we will be 3/5. That's 20, 40, 60% of the way through the prakim of Masechta Avodah Zarah. On today's daf, we will be discussing goraym. Interesting sugya. Goraym. We'll see. I guess maybe you could say I guess you could say machlekes Rashi and Tosfos about how exactly to understand goraym. Tosfos is a lot clearer on how he kind of defines goraym. We're going to see that very interesting stuff. You don't want to miss it. And then we will learn 2 more mishnahs. We'll learn 3 mishnahs today. So goraym is the first mishnah. Then we're going to learn about what happens when some Avodah Zarah gets mixed together with some other Avodah Zarah. What do you do? What can you do? And finally, being mevatel Avodah Zarah, nullifying Avodah Zarah. And with that, we will finish today's daf and perek Shlishi, the third perek of Masechta Avodah Zarah. Chevra, let's jump in. We have exciting stuff on today's daf, so let us get excited. Okay, we're going to start on daf Mem Ches Amid Beis at the Mishnah. Got a little work to do, probably about 15-20 lines from the bottom of daf Mem Ches Amid Beis. Zokt, the Mishnah Zor in, we've seen this before. Tachtel Yirakis B'Mosak Shomim Aval lo b'mosachama, v'achzirin lo b'mosacham v'lo b'mosak shomim. Rabbi Yosef ma'af lo yirakas b'mosak shomim b'nei she'anavi anosher saleh v'hava lehen lezevel. Okay, so here's the thing, friends. Vegetables, I'm not a farmer yet, but vegetables, I guess, want sunlight. Well, I think maybe it depends. So here's the thing. Apparently during the winter, vegetables can kind of use whatever sunlight they can get. It would be beneficial for the vegetables in the winter, during the rainy season, to not be under a tree. Being under a tree, they're gonna struggle to thrive under a tree during the winter. However, during the summer, where it's very sunny, they could benefit from being under a tree. So again, during the winter, being under a tree is undesirable for vegetables, being planted under a tree. However, during the winter, it's undesirable. During the summer, it would be desirable to be under a tree. So the Tanakama says, let's read it again. Zorin tachter yirakus b'mosak hasham. Therefore, if you have an Asherah tree, an Avodah Zarah tree, and you don't want to be getting benefit from the tree, so in the winter, planting vegetables under a Asherah tree will not be benefiting the vegetables or you who want the vegetables. And therefore, the Mishnah says, Zarin tachter yirakus b'mosak hasham. Therefore, it's permitted to plant vegetables under an Asherah tree during the winter because you're not getting benefit from the tree. It's detrimental. During the summer, however, where it's beneficial for the vegetables to get some shade, that is not allowed because you'll be benefiting from the shade of the Asherah tree during the summer where it's beneficial to get shade. So that would be unallowed. That would not be allowed. Now, Rabbi Yossi disagrees, however. He says it's never allowed. Certainly not during the summer where clearly the shade of the tree would be beneficial to the vegetables. Certainly not in the summer, but even during the winter, it's not allowed. Why is it not allowed during the winter? And we've seen this before. Because even in the winter, sure, the shade is not helpful because the vegetables can benefit from any sun that they can get in the winter, and therefore the shade is not helpful. However, what is helpful is that in the winter, the leaves of the Asherah tree will shed and fall on the vegetables and turn to compost and become part of the earth and benefit the vegetables as compost. And therefore, even in the winter, it's not allowed, says Rabbi Yossi. And then the Mishnah also says that when it comes to romaine lettuce, when it comes to salad, when it comes to lettuce, whether we're talking about the summer, whether we're talking about the winter, no planting under Asherah trees. Okay, I guess it's probably beneficial for the lettuce in either climate, in either season. So again, so let's read this Mishnah Nachamo. Zarin tafta yirakis b'mosag. You may, according to the Tanakama, plant vegetables under an Asherah tree during the winter, where the vegetables can use whatever sun they can get, and therefore it's detrimental to be under the Asherah tree. Avalo b'mosachama, but during the summer, where the vegetables could use a little bit of shade, well then you may not plant under an Asherah tree in the summer because they will be benefiting from the shade of the Asherah tree. Ve'achazirin, when it comes to romaine lettuce, lo bimos hacham v'lo bimos hageshamim. Romaine lettuce may be planted underneath in the shade of an Asherah tree, neither during the summer nor during the winter. Now, Rabbi Yossi however, Rabbi Yossi dissents, and he says, Aflo Yurakis bimos hageshamim, Yurakis cannot be planted under an Asherah tree even during the winter. How come? Because while sure the shade may be detrimental, however, but because the leaves will shed onto the vegetables and turn to compost, which will in turn benefit the vegetables. And for that reason, Rabbi Yossi says osur even during the winter. So now, frag the Gemara, lemeimra, the Rabbi Yossi sover zev zagorim osur rabbanan amre zev zagorim muter ipcha shaminalu d'tanan Rabbi Yossi omer shochik v'zor l'ruach u'mat l'yom amlo afi nase zevel v'nem lo yibak b'yod chamuma min acher kash rabban kash Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yossi. Wow. The Gemara asks an awesome kasha. Can anybody here at Babylon Talmud explain to me, does anybody want to explain to everybody else what the Gemara's amazing kasha is? The Gemara's amazing kasha is this, that, okay, wow, this is so awesome. Zev v'zeh goraym osur. What does zev v'zeh goraym osur mean? Or zev v'zeh goraym muter, what does zev v'zeh goraym mean? Zev v'zeh goraym means when you have two contributing factors. So, for example, one place where we saw zev v'zeh goraym, wait, do I want to, maybe should I use a different example? Oh yeah, why not? That's an easier example. I'm only going to focus on examples that come up on today's daf, just so that we're not bringing more than we need to. So later on today's daf, we are going to see an example about a cow that you want to fatten up, so that people can enjoy it at a steakhouse. So you want to fatten up the cow. Okay, so you fatten up the cow with, I don't know, whatever you fatten up a cow with fatternizer. That's what you fatten up a cat with, fatternizer. It's a nice word. So you're fattening up this cow with some kosher fatternizer. But then what happens is, at a certain point, the fatternizer distributor, gives you some Avodah Zarah fatternizer. So now, what has contributed to the fattening up of this cow? Kosher fatternizer, but also non-kosher fatternizer, both contributed to this cow. So this cow isn't entirely fattened up by Avodah Zarah. It's not like it's been eating Avodah Zarah its entire life. By the time the Avodah Zarah came, it was already fattened up quite a bit by kosher fatternizer. So, but then the Avodah Zarah fatternizer came and fattened it up more. So the result is a cow that's been fatternized by kosher and non-kosher fatternizer. So the shaila is that osur or mutter? When you have two contributing factors, one osur, one mutter, and they come together to create a result, is that result mutter or osur? I was avoiding using this example. I just like it. So you know what? I'm going to use it anyways. We saw the other day an example I wanted to avoid using external ones, especially because Tosfos is going to have an interesting mahalach on how to understand zev as a goraym, and I don't really want to include another factor, but I'm going to do it anyways. I don't think it's. I think it'll. I don't think it will create trouble for us. So here it is, because I think it's just an easier example to understand than fraternizer. Say you have a u. Hi, Diana. Say you had an u that was worshipped as Avodah Zarah. So that u cannot be offered as a korban, okay? And now what if a ram comes and the ram and the u make a baby? How do you relate to that baby? That baby is a result of a osir u and a mutter ram. An osir u, a mutter ram came together and made a baby. Is that baby mutter? Is that also? You have zeh, osir, vizeh, mutter, goraym, created, right, caused this third reality. So that's what zev goraym is, when you have two contributing factors to a reality. So in our Mishnah, Rabbi Yossi had said, you cannot plant vegetables underneath an asherah tree, even in the winter. Why? Well, because the leaves are going to fall and compost, and you have the earth that's already there. And this is at least how we want to understand this, that Rabbi Yossi is essentially saying that the combination of the Avodah Zarah leaves from the asherah tree and the mutter earth will join together in order to grow these vegetables and create these vegetables. And so you have zev goraym. Sounds like Rabbi Yossi is saying is zev goraym is osir. And the Chachamim say, nah, it's okay. You could plant the vegetables underneath the asherah tree during the winter. What about the compost? They seem to not be too concerned about it. So it sounds like they're saying zev goraym is mutter. Tosfos is actually going to ask an interesting kasha, but they only say that you could plant during the winter. What about during the summer? They are concerned about the asherah tree. But anyways, Tosfos is going to give an interesting shot. We'll get there a little bit later. Anyways, so it sounds like from our Mishnah, Rabbi Yossi says osir, the Chacham say mutter. It must be that Rabbi Yossi holds zev goraym osir, and the Chacham say zev goraym mutter. But chevra, here's the question. The question is that we have seen recently. Where did we see? Where was this Mishnah? This Mishnah was on Daf Mem Gimel. This Mishnah was on Daf Mem Gimel. What perek was Daf Mem Gimel? Our perek. That we had seen on Daf Mem Gimel, a machlokes between Rabbi Yossi, where Rabbi Yossi says that when disposing of Avodah Zarah, you can grind it up, throw it into the air, and the air will carry it and scatter it on the ground, and that's sufficient. The Avodah Zarah is bottled, it's gone. Whereas the Chacham said, ma pitom, the ground up Avodah Zarah is going to become a fertilizer and mix together with the existing earth, and together the existing earth and the fertilizer are going to come together in order to nourish crops, or to create crops or whatever. So over there, Rabbi Yossi is the one saying mutter, the Chacham are the one saying osir. Rabbi Yossi seems unfazed about the fact that this Avodah Zarah fertilizer is going to mix together with the earth and create crops. He's unfazed. Sounds like he's holding zev goraym is mutter, whereas the Chacham is saying ma pitom, you can't do that. Sounds like they're saying zev goraym is osir. Punkt verkehrt from what we have in our Mishnah. What do you think about the Gemara's kasha? What do you think about the Gemara's kasha? It's nice, right? It's nice. Zev goraym, osir, mutter, here, there. Very nice. It's like fine wine. There's something great about appreciating it, This is a little bit deeper than fine wine, I'd say. Maybe it depends how fine, but Gemara runs deep, Chevra. Gemara runs deep. Okay. Here we go. So I'm starting again from the beginning of the Gemara. The Meimah de Rabbi Yossi sav zev goraym also rabbanan amei zev goraym mutter. So from looking at our Mishnah, where Rabbi Yossi says you cannot plant under these trees even during the winter. And the Chacham say you can. It sounds like from our Mishnah, again, the Mevatel said to Rabbi Yossi, so if Zev Zagorim Osir, that Rabbi Yossi says Zev Zagorim is Osir, Rabbanan Amrei, Zev Zagorim Mutter, whereas the Rabbi says Zev Zagorim Mutter, Ha'ipcha Shaminanu. But we learned on that Mem Gimel Punkt Fakert. Rabbi Yossi says, Rabbi Yossi, Shoichek v'zor el haruach. If you want to dispose of Avodah Zarah, no problem. Grind it up, throw it into the air, problem solved. What about the fact that it's going to land and fertilize the earth? Meh. Sounds like we're saying Zev Zagorim is mutter, according to Rabbi Yossi there. Alternatively, of course, you could throw it into the sea. But the rabbi said to him, you can't do that. It's going to turn into fertilizer, and it is going to fertilize the earth, right? So together the earth, together with the ground up of Avodah Zarah, which is going to be fertilizer, tzezamen, they're going to create, to nourish these vegetables. Whenever, and after all, the pasuk says, Lo yidbak biyotcha me'uma min acher. You can't have any Avodah Zarah at all. Not even Zev Zagorim. So kash d'Rabbanan d'Rabbanan, kash d'Yossi. Everybody seems contradictory. The Rabbanan here sounds like they're saying Zev Zagorim Mutter. Over there it sounds like they're saying Zev Zagorim Osir. Sounds like over here Rabbi Yossi is saying Zev Zagorim Osir. Sounds like over there he's saying Zev Zagorim Mutter. Chava, what do we do? Okay. Bishlam Rabbi Yossi like kasha. I can explain Rabbi Yossi. I can say, look, Rabbi Yossi holds Zev Zagorim Osir, as we see in our Mishnah. He says you can't plant under the tree even in the winter because Zev Zagorim Osir. So kasha holding the ka'azal le'ibud matirachad lo ka'azal le'ibud osir. So over there, shochek v'zor leruach, where you're destroying it, even though so there isn't actually any Zev Zagorim because you're destroying it. But over here, nothing's being destroyed, and therefore Zev Zagorim is osir. So really, Rabbi Yossi holds Zev Zagorim is osir. Zev Zagorim is osir, as we see over here in our Mishnah, right? The leaves are going to fall and land on the vegetables, and they're going to compost, and they're Avodah Zarah, and they're going to join with the earth, and that's going to be a problem. Therefore, it's osir. Zev Zagorim osir. So how do you understand by shochek v'zor l'ruach? And how do you understand where Rabbi Yossi says just grind up the Avodah Zarah and throw it into the wind, and that's fine? What about Zev Zagorim osir? Over there it says, it's machlekes Rashi and Tosfos what that means. Rashi, interestingly, says, well, look, Rashi is be'etzem siding with Rish Lakish, and arguably Shmuel. There was a machlekes, do you remember? There was a machlekes Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish a few days ago about Avodah Zarah shenishtaber me'elel. What happens when you have Avodah Zarah that breaks on its own? Rabbi Yochanan says it's still osir. Rish Lakish says it becomes mutter because anybody who was worshipping that Avodah Zarah will definitely have to ask themselves some hard questions and say, was I really worshipping an idol that can't even protect itself? How is it going to protect me? And therefore it's mutter. And therefore, Rashi is really explaining Asum de Ka'azal Ibud from the perspective of Rish Lakish. At least so I understand it. That's also, I think Tosfos seems to understand Rashi that way as well, which is that over there where he's grinding it up, so it's essentially like, right, if we say that Avodah Zarah shenishtaber me'elel is osir, because it couldn't protect itself. So here you're grinding up the Avodah Zarah. Also, it's be'etzem batel. And even according to we explained a few days ago that even according to the rabbis who say mapitom, it's fertilizer, that's only we explained because of concern of Rava that maybe we'll have picked it up first and then mikone, whatever it is. But really, be'etzem, says Rashi, over there it's a holech li'ibud. It should be considered Avodah Zarah shenishtaber me'elel, and therefore be'etzem, it's not really Zev Zagorim because really the idol is already destroyed. And it's not really Avodah Zarah anymore. There isn't really a concern over there. There's a concern about Rava, maybe picked it up first, but there isn't really a concern. Therefore, over there, Rabbi Yossi says it's okay, you can grind it up and throw it in the air, it's fine. Tosfos has a different pshat over there because Tosfos isn't super comfortable that Rashi's paskening like Rish Lakish, and what about Rabbi Yochanan's shita? And Tosfos Be'etzim says that what does it mean hosim to cause leibud? Simply put, it means you're taking Avodah Zarah, you're grinding it up, throwing it to the wind. If I would say to you the phrase, just throw it to the wind, what does it sound like? It sounds like nothing meaningful is going to come out of it. That's what it sounds like, right? If you just take something and just throw it to the wind. Sounds like you basically don't care whatever happens to it. You don't expect anything meaningful to ever become of it. So therefore, Tosfos says, what does it mean? Hasam to cause leibud. It means that by shochik v'zor leruach, he's grinding up an idol. He's throwing it to the wind. In order for it to be usable fertilizer, you probably have to take it and concentrate it in a particular area. So you're throwing it to the wind. You'll have a speck over here, a speck over there. It's not going to be able to accomplish anything meaningful in the ground. So therefore, over there, is not really. It's not actually zev goraym aser or zev goraym at all, because this ground up of Avodah Zarah will be spread way too thin. There isn't actually an expectation of any kind of zev goraym. Nothing's causing nothing over there. Okay, so therefore you can say that Rabbi Yossi Be'etzim holds zev goraym is aser, as we see in our Mishnah. What about shochik v'zor laruach? Meh. Over there, the cause of leibud, there isn't really a concern over there. El d'Rabbanan kasha, but what do we do about the rabbis? Over there, they're concerned. Ma pitom, it's going to be fertilizer, zev goraym aser. And over here, they're saying, no problem, plant under the tree. What about the leaves? Zev goraym is mutter. Is it aser or is it mutter? Ipuch. So the Gemara says, how about this? Flip our Mishnah around over here. It's Rabbi Yossi who says you could plant under the tree in the winter, because he says zev goraym mutter. And that also makes it easier to explain shochik v'zor leruach, because at the end of the day, Rabbi Yossi holds zev goraym is mutter, and therefore here also he says plant under the tree in the winter, no problem, and say that the rabbis are the ones who say that you have to be concerned about the compost, and zev goraym is aser, just like they said over there, you can't throw it to the wind because of the fertilizer, zev goraym aser. So if you just flip around our Mishnah, then everything aligns. Instead of Rabbi Yossi in one place saying aser, another place saying mutter, and the Chacham in one place saying aser, the other place saying mutter, if you just flip them around, then they both are consistent. Aser, mutter, mutter. Azoy. V'bay sema, alternatively, lo tepo. Or I can give you an alternative answer where you don't have to switch nothing around. The Rabbi Yossi Kedeshaninon, and in terms of Rabbi Yossi, it's how we already explained it. Be'etzim Rabbi Yossi holds zev goraym is aser. Then how do we understand shochik v'zor leruach? Well, because there it's holech leibud, so there isn't really a concern anyways. And in terms of the Rabbanon, Kide Omar Rav Mari Breder Rav Kahana Masha Mashbiach Bor Pogim Bebosor Chanam Masha Mashbiach Benavoya Pogim Betzel. Okay. It's like Rav Mari Breder Rav Kahana says in Timura, and also I think in Bechoris, I'm just looking at them, sorry, Sashas. Okay, so we're going to learn a lot more about this when we get to Seder Kodshim. Seder Kodshim is mamish around the corner. In about 4 or 5 weeks, we will be learning masechta Zvachim. And we will learn all about these things, I'm sure. But anyways, if you have an animal, if you're makdish an animal, but this animal needs to be brought as you're going to bring this animal as a korban, but then it gets a mum. It's a blemish. So now you can't offer it as a korban because it has a blemish. Okay, so what do? You can't offer it, so you sell it. Okay, so if Ruvain had set aside an animal, it's going to be a korban, but the animal got a blemish. So what do? So you sell the animal to Shimon, and then instead of the animal being hektish now, the animal's chulin now. It's not hektish. The money that Reuven received for his animal is now hektish, and he uses that money to buy a new animal. And he offers the new animal. Now, what happens to the original animal that has a blemish? So now Shimon owns it. So Shimon can slaughter it and eat it. However, there are still certain relics. There are still certain leftovers. It's not completely, right? There are still restrictions on the original animal. You could slaughter it and eat it, sure. But there are still restrictions. One example of that restriction is that after you slaughter the animal, you cannot hang it upside down by its legs in order to flay the hide from the animal. And now that would be the ideal way, apparently. I'm not a butcher yet, but apparently that would be the ideal way to get the hide in the best shape. If you want to get the hide in one piece and you want to sell it for the best price, you're going to want to remove the hide while the animal is hanging upside down by its feet. However, the halacha is you can't do that because it's busy in kachut. Because this animal was once hektish, it was once going to be a korban. And therefore, since this animal was once a korban, there are still certain limitations to what you can do with it. One of those limitations, you cannot hang it upside down by its feet because it's busy in kachut. It's not mechubad for an animal that was once hektish. But now the shaila is, but they ask, they say, 1 second, you're missing the forest for the trees. Yes, maybe it's not nice to hang the animal upside down, but you're missing out on the big picture, which is if you allow hanging the animal upside down so that the hide can be removed in the best possible way, and therefore the best possible price can be fetched for that hide, well then Shimon, who bought the animal, who bought the blemished animal, milchatchila will be willing to pay a higher price for this blemished animal if he knows that he can get a very good hide from it. And if Reuven receives more money for his blemished animal, well then the new animal that he can buy can be a better animal. And ultimately, if you look in the big picture, Hektish wins by allowing Shimon to hang the sheep upside down. Let's say it's a sheep to allow hang the sheep upside down to get off the hide in the best possible way, because that way Shimon will be willing to pay more for it, and then Reuven could buy a better animal. And so yes, if we look kind of at what's in front of our noses, yes, there's an animal that was once hektish that is hanging upside down. But if we look beyond our noses, we'll see, well, because it's hanging upside down, the hide is going to be in better condition. Therefore, Shimon can sell it for more money. Therefore, he'll be willing to pay Reuven more money for it. And then Reuven could buy a better animal for it. And Hektish ultimately wins by simply allowing the animal to be hanged upside down. To which the Gemara says, that's also short-sighted. Because you know what? When the animal is hanging upside down, and when they are removing the hide in a way that prioritizes the quality of the hide, but that comes at a cost as well. What's the cost? The cost in the meat. By cutting the hide off that way, it actually damages the meat. It actually damages the meat. So what you might gain by a better hide, you lose by damaged meat, in which case the quality of the meat is not as good. And therefore, so therefore, at the end of the day, what you benefit from the hide, you lose out on the meat. And therefore, if you say, don't hang it upside down, so now you can't remove the hide in the beneficial way for the hide, but the meat is in better condition. So there's that. So therefore, we say at the end of the day, either the hide's going to be better or the meat is going to be better. So don't do bizin kodshim. The point being that there's a give and take. So just like we said by kodshim, that which you gain from the hide, you lose from the meat. So here also, even though the Chacham say zev goraym is osir, but here they say it's okay, you could plant under the tree, because ultimately any benefit that you're going to be getting from the compost, from the leaves that fall, is going to be canceled out from the fact that it's the rainy season and these vegetables are under a tree. So therefore, if you're going to want to say mapitom, how can the Chacham say that they could plant under the tree? It's going to the vegetables are going to benefit from the compost, and zev goraym is osir. Any benefit is not really benefit because it's going to be canceled out by the fact that it's under a tree during the winter. So again, so you can answer for the rabbis. The Rabbanan could Amr of Mari Beit of Kahana. It's like if my Beit of Kahana says Mashbiach, or whatever you're going to benefit from a higher quality hide, poging bebasar, it's going to come at the cost of causing damage to the meat. So Achanami Mashbiach ben Avaya, any benefit that you might get from this compost coming from the Asherah tree, poging betzel, is going to be canceled out from the fact that it's underneath a tree during the winter. Okay, so b'etzem what we're saying right now is that both Rabbi Yossi and the Chacham agree that zev goraym is osir, and it's just interesting to see how where they apply it and how they apply it, but both b'etzem agree zev goraym osir. However, Rabbi Yossi is lenient, I guess you could say, when it comes to shochik v'zor l'ruach, because it's going to be destroyed anyways. And the Chacham are lenient over here because any benefit is going to be canceled out. But be'etzin, they both hold zev goraym is aser. Wow, sheesh, this is probably going to be a long daf. We're not even on today's daf yet. We're still on daf memches. Sheesh. I feel like we've been having a lot of long dafs in masechta Avodah Zarah. I feel like maybe that was a little bit unexpected. Wow. It's interesting stuff, though, in my opinion. Okay. Now, frag the Gemara, v'sover Rabbi Yossi zev goraym aser? Or, but now the Gemara asks, does Rabbi Yossi really hold zev goraym is aser? Does Rabbi Yossi really hold that? V'atnan we learn in the Mishnah, Rabbi Yossi almost says Rabbi Yossi, note in yichur shel orla ve'ein note in egos shel orla mipnei shu pri. Says Rabbi Yossi, you can plant a shoot of orla. Okay, so let's say you have an apple tree. You plant an apple tree. For the first 3 years, it's orla. Or let's say a fig tree. For the first 3 years, it's orla. Now, but the thing is, orla applies to the fruits of the tree, not the branches. So, Rabbi Yossi says, Rabbi Yossi, note in yichur shel orla, you can plant a shoot of orla. So if you cut off one of the branches from the fig tree, that's orla, it's within its first 3 years. But you could plant that branch in the ground, and any fruits that come from it will be fine, and any fruits from it will not be aser or anything like that. The ein not in egos shalola mipnei shu pri, but you can't plant a nut of orla because that is a fruit, right? This egos is a fruit, and the fruit is aser bahana. I believe orla. I think you cannot get a nut from orla. Yeah, it's also bahana. It's for sure also bahana. Yeah, it's also bahana. Yeah, the orla is also bahana. Yeah, orla is also bahana. So you can't plant that nut because it's aser bahana. You can't plant that nut because it's aser bahana. It's aser bahana. Okay. Because it's a fruit, it's orla, it's also bahana. The Amar Ravina Marab, it says Ravina Marab, Moda Rabbi Yossi, but Rabbi Yossi, however, admits, and here we go, She'im nota vivich v'hirkib mutter. Okay, so this is actually, so this is actually where She'im nota vivich v'hirkib mutter. So this is where I'll kind of get into the machlokas Rashi and Tosfos here. So the way that Rashi explains this is that, so Rabbi Yossi says you can't plant the nut because the nut is orla and it's also you can't plant it. However, from Rav Yehuda Marav says Rav Yehuda Marav, Moder Rabbi Yossi she'im nota vivich v'hirkib mutter. But if he did plant, so now here's the machlokas Rashi and Tosfos. That Rashi says she'im nota means if he planted the egos itself, the nut itself, right? She'im nota ha'egos shel orla mutter. So Rashi says that Rabbi Yossi, however, admits that if he does plant the nut, you're not allowed to, but if he does, so then mutter, it's permitted. Because at the end of the day, zev goraym is mutter. What do you mean zev goraym? Well, you're going to plant the nut, and what's going to result from the nut? A tree. What's going to result from the nut is a new tree. So what's the status of this new tree? Is it aser? No, it's mutter. Why is the new tree mutter? Well, because it's a product of the earth, which is kosher, and the nut, which was aser bano, it's orla. But together, the earth and the nut is also, the earth is mutter, together they'll create a new tree. Zev goraym is mutter. That's how Rashi explains it. Then he talks about v'hivich v'hirkib, and then also if he took a branch of orla and he kind of grasped that into a tree, that could also be mutter. But he also says zev goraym. I think after Tosfos asks his kashas, I think Rashi is a little more difficult to understand, but we're still going to stick with Rashi just because that's the flow. We're going to stick with Rashi. So, but we'll get to Tosfos in a second. So Rashi, so what's going on according to Rashi? So basically, we had said that Rabbi Yossi's opinion is zev goraym is osur. However, here we get to this Mishnah where Rabbi Yossi says, don't plant this nut of orla because it's a fruit. It's also banoi. You can't plant it. What if you did? It's mutter because at the end of the day, zev goraym is mutter according to Rabbi Yossi. That the earth, which is mutter, and the nut, which is also, will come tzazam, they'll come together, they'll create a tree, and that product will be zev goraym mutter at the end of the day. Tosfos has a remarkable kasha. Who can tell me what Tosfos' kasha is? It's important that we hear because Tosfos is like a valdige shita. We're not going to explain the Gemara like Tosfos, but it's an awesome shita. Makes a lot of sense, I think. Tosfos Vesim asks, if you look at our Mishnah, friends, now the opinion of the Tanakhama is interesting, right? Because what did the Tanakhama say? Tanakhama had said that you can plant vegetables under the Asherah tree during the winter. Because at the end of the day, the shade is bad for it, and therefore at the end of the day, the shade, you're not getting any benefit from the tree. But interestingly, what's the implication? The Mishnah said, Tanakhama says explicitly, but during the summer it's not allowed. Now, if you remember back to the beginning of the Gemara for a second, the initial havamina of the Gemara, and this is what Tosfos is referring to at the time, the initial havamina of the Gemara was to say that according to the Rabbanon, because they say that you're allowed to plant the vegetables under the Asherah tree in the winter, so the initial havamina of the Gemara is Lememra, Rabbi Yosef zev goraym also Rabbanon sav zev goraym mutter. The initial havamina of the Gemara was to say, so what do we see from the Mishnah? That even though the vegetables will be benefiting from the compost falling from the tree, Rabbi Yossi had said it's osur, but the havamina of the Gemara was to say that according to the Chachamim, that would be mutter. And even though the vegetables will be benefiting both from the earth as well as from the compost, zev goraym is mutter. But now Tosfos points out that, well, if we want to say that because that this proves zev goraym is mutter, that you're going to be getting benefit from the earth as well as from the compost. And if you say zev goraym mutter, but at the same time, the Chacham had said that in the summer it's osur, because it's going to be getting benefit from the tree as well as from the earth. But if you say zev goraym is mutter, then that should be permitted, right? The havamina of the Gemara was to say from the Chacham, from the fact that you're allowed to plant the vegetables under the tree during the winter, so that must be that the rabbis hold zev goraym mutter, while also the Mishnah at the same time had said that you can't plant it in the summer. But if you say zev goraym is mutter, then what's the havamina to say that the rabbis say that zev goraym is mutter if they themselves said that you can't do it in the summer? But if zev goraym is mutter, what's the problem with planting in the summer? Basically, it's because of this that Tosfos gives a definition of what zev goraym mutter is. And this is what I think is awesome, and it applies now to our Gemara. So sorry to take you back for a second to the havamina of the Reisha. It's a little bit technical, but it gets to Tosfos' yesod, which is mamish gevaldik. So here we go. Here's the yesod, and the yesod is that according to Tosfos, in order to say zev goraym, you must be talking about the same things. So, for example, when we're talking about the cow that is being fattened up with fatternizer, so some of that fatternizer was kosher, some of it was Avodah Zarah, but it's all fatternizer. You have some kosher, you have some not kosher, zev goraym. If you use the example that I didn't want to use before, and the Gemara doesn't use it, so I'm a little bit uncomfortable using it, but still, you have the oo that was worshipped, and the ram, right? So the oo is osur, the ram is mutter. They're both sheep. They're both rams. So you have zev goraym. However, okay, and then another example would be, therefore, in our Mishnah, when we have the vegetables growing under the tree, that's Avodah Zarah, and you have the leaves that are composting on the ground. The compost is earth, becomes soil. So what will happen is the leaves will fall to the ground, and then the vegetables will be a product of the earth, which is not Avodah Zarah, and the leaves that are composting and becoming earth, and they are Avodah Zarah, and you can have the kosher earth and the Avodah Zarah earth, zev goraym. So the havamina of the Gemara was to say, so we see the Chacham say zev goraym is mutter. Why didn't they apply then? What about the fact that they also say that during the summer it's osur? Why? Because it's going to be getting benefit from the shade of the tree. Okay, but the product of the vegetables during the summer also will be a product of the earth, which is kosher, the shade of the share tree, which is not okay. It's Avodah Zarah. But if you say zev is goraym mutter, well then who cares? During the summer it should be okay as well. To which Tosfos says no, because in the summer you're talking about apples and oranges. In the summer you have earth and shade, apples and oranges. When you're talking about earth and leaves that are going to fall and become earth, it's earth and earth. When you're talking about a ram and an ewe, it's a sheep and a sheep. When you're talking about kosher fatenizer and not kosher fatenizer, it's all fatenizer. But when you're talking about earth and you're talking about shade, those are two separate things. And Chebe, this is how it ties into our Gemara over here, and it's so beautiful. Because Rashi was saying, Chebe, it's really beautiful. Rashi was saying that what's zev goraym here by Rabbi Yossi with the orla and planting the nut in the ground? Rashi was saying that ultimately, even though Rabbi Yossi says don't plant the nut in the ground, ultimately if you do, it's okay, because the result will be zev goraym. You have the nut, that's osir, and you have the ground, that's mutter. It's going to create a tree, and the tree is a product of the ground, which is mutter, and the nut, which is osir. Tosfos says, no, that's not zev goraym, because it's apples and oranges. Earth is apples, nuts are oranges. That would be also, that would not be zev goraym. Even if it says zev goraym mutter, this is not zev goraym. This is apples and oranges. Zev goraym is only when it's apples to apples. So therefore, Tosfos answers, and Tosfos says, look, yes, they understand. They also say nutta means planting the nut. That nutta does mean planting the nut. However, Tosfos says that resulting tree will not be mutter like Rashi says, because that's not actually zev goraym. Rashi had said that, well, the resulting tree would be the nut that's osir and the earth that's mutter, and together create a tree. No, Tosfos says that tree is going to be osir. She'im nota, that if he planted that nut, that resulting tree is going to be osir, because it came from a nut that was orla. However, if you then take a branch from that tree, which is osir, right, because it came from the nut, which is osir bana. So therefore, any tree that results from the growth of that nut is also going to be osir, right? You can't just take something that's osir bana and plant it, and now all of a sudden it's mutter. No, it's osir bana. Any tree that results from it is going to be osir. But if you then take a branch from that tree and graft that into a kosher tree, well, then any resulting fruits, which would be from a osir branch and a kosher tree, that resulting fruit will be zev goraym and mutter. So therefore, Mother Rabbi Yossi noted that if he did plant the nut, the hivrich v'yirkiv, and then he took a branch from the resulting osir tree and grafted that with another tree, so it's apples to apples, branch to branch, mutter, it is permitted. Anyways, Chevra, I just wanted to highlight that Tosfos, because it was so beautiful, that Tosfos defines zev goraym as meaning. It's important for thinking about zev goraym. It seemed like a very important sheet of Tosfos that he defines zev goraym as being apples to apples. They have an osir apple and a mutter apple. In this case, an osir branch and a mutter branch. Anyways, now that we mentioned Tosfos' shita, I'm going to go back and explain the rest of the sugya like Rashi, because we generally go with Rashi, and Rashi had says that if he plants this nut, then the resulting tree will be mutter, because Rashi considers zev goraym being the earth and the nut, and the resulting tree will be mutter. And we also learn in a brisa like this, Moder Rabbi Yossi, that Rabbi Yossi admits she'im nota behivrich v'hirkiv mutter, that if he planted this nut, or if he grafted orla, well then it would be mutter, because you would have zev goraym, you would have essentially the osir orla and the mutter trees or earth or whatever it is, and it would create and it would be mutter new. So what do we see? What do we see at the end of the day? At the end of the day, we see that Rabbi Yossi is saying zev goraym is mutter. So on the one hand, we wanted to say up until now that Rabbi Yossi's shita is zev goraym is osir. However, now we're starting to see Rabbi Yossi saying zev goraym is mutter. We saw by orla, plant this nut of orla. The result is mutter. Zev goraym is mutter. And if you're going to say Rabbi Yossi ben Sha'ari Surin Avodah Zarah, okay, well maybe Rabbi Yossi distinguishes, he differentiates between Avodah Zarah, which is, of course, very extreme, very, very severe, very machmir. So Rabbi Yossi distinguishes between Avodah Zarah and other things. So while by Orla, Rabbi Yossi might say Zev Zegorim is mutter, but by Avodah Zarah he'll say Zev Zegorim is aser. Umishani, but is that really true? Umishani le'v'atanib, we learn in a brayso. Sadishin is dablo bezevel avodas kochavim, v'chein parashin is patma bekarshine avodas kochavim. A field that was fertilized with a fertilizer that's Avodah Zarah. So you have the earth, and then you also have fertilizer of Avodah Zarah. Or a cow that was fattened up with fatternizer that is Avodah Zarah. Of course, there was also kosher Avodah Zarah, but then it continued being fattened with Avodah Zarah. But there was kosher fatternizer, and then Avodah Zarah fatternizer was used. So Tanichad Sada Tizara Para Tishachet, the first brisa, so we have two unattributed brises. We're trying to figure out who to attribute them to. The first unattributed brisa says, no problem. You can plant seeds in that field. You can slaughter that cow and eat it and enjoy it. V'tanidach Sada Tavor Ufara Tiraze. Whereas the other brisa says the opposite. You have to leave the field alone until any benefit that was provided by the Avodah Zarah fertilizer is gone. You just have to leave it until the fertilizer just kind of, goes away over time. And the cow, you have to put it on a diet so that any fattening that was caused by the Avodah Zarah fatternizer that weight will be lost. So my love, we want to say that how do we explain these two brises? Right? One of them is, clearly it sounds like it's a machlokas about Zev Zegorim. Right? I mean, that seems to be pretty clear. You have a field of kosher earth with non-kosher fertilizer, and any plants that result will be Zev Zegorim. You have this cow that's a result of kosher food and Avodah Zarah food, Zev Zegorim. The first brisa says no problem. The second brisa says big problem. So let's say that who's the first brisa that says no problem? Rabbi Yossi, Zev Zegorim mutter. Who's the second brisa? The Chacham, Zev Zegorim aser. So if this is the case, well then Rabbi Yossi seems to be saying also even by Avodah Zarah, Zev Zegorim is mutter. So again, we want to say Rabbi Yossi also says Zev Zegorim is aser. But it seems to be emerging by Orla, by Avodah Zarah, that Rabbi Yossi actually seems to be saying Zev Zegorim is taka mutter. So the Gemara says, no. Rabbi Yossi is not the one who says Zev Zegorim mutter by Avodah Zarah. Hareb Eliezer v'Rabbanan machlekes Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbanan. The first brisa, Zev Zegorim is mutter, is the Rabbanan. Now the question is going to be which Rabbanan, because the Rabbanan until now we're saying Zev Zegorim is aser. So the question is, who are these rabbis? We'll get to that question later on. But anyways, the first brisa, we're saying it's machlekes Rabbanan and Rabbi Eliezer. The first brisa says Zev Zegorim by Avodah Zarah is mutter. That's the Chacham, it's the Rabbanan. And the second brisa, where we're saying Zev Zegorim is also, that's Rabbi Eliezer. Hey, Rabbi Eliezer Rabbanan, Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbanan, where? I'm just throwing out names, right? Where do we see this argument? Rabbi Eliezer Rabbanan disor. If it's the machlokes Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbanan by Levin, Disnan, that we learn in the Mishnah, Seor, Shel Chulim v'Seor, Shel Trumeh, Shenaf, L'Lusaycha Isa, Le'Bazek Kedei L'Chametz, Le'Bazek Kedei L'Chametz, V'Nitztarfu V'Chimtzu. So the machlokes is about a scenario where there was dough. I'm not a baker yet, but there was, I guess, flour. Yeah, I feel like there's flour in dough. Maybe some water, maybe? Yeah, okay, that sounds about right. Yeah, that sounds about right. Flour, water, that sounds about right. Yeah, that sounds like a dough. Yeah, bread, flour, water. That sounds right. And then you take some, I guess like starter, right? Some leaven. And I guess there needs to be a certain amount of leaven in order to leaven the bread, the dough. And some truma leaven got in there. and some chulin leaven got in there. Of course, the chulin leaven is what we want, so that the bread is chulin, that anybody can eat it. The truma can only be eaten by the kohanim, and it would be usher to me. So I'm a Yisrael, so if any truma fell in there, it's usher to me. And the whole dough is usher. Now, the interesting thing about the scenario is that neither the truma, right, so both truma and chulin leaven fell into the bread, into the dough, but neither had quantities that would be able to, neither in quantities that would be able to actually raise the dough on its own. There was only, say, half a quantity of chulin and half a quantity of truma. So let's read that again. So or shel chulin v'shel truma, leaven, right, starter, I guess you could say, of chulin v'shel truma, and starter of truma, shenafu l'socha isa, that fell into a dough, leibozek de lechametz, leibozek de lechametz, and neither the chulin nor the truma had enough. There was neither enough starter of truma nor of chulin to start the bread on their own. V'netztarfu, but they joined tzazamin, and they created a team. V'chimtu, and as a team, they jointly leavened the dough. That we go based on whatever fell in last. If the truma fell in last, the dough is truma and it's aser l'zarb. If the chulin fell in last, then it's chulin and anybody can eat it. Whereas the chacham say, bein shenofel iser l'chatchila uben shenofel iser l'vasob. It doesn't matter whether the truma fell in first or last. The dough will only be considered to be truma if there was enough truma to leaven the dough. So long as there wasn't enough truma starter on its own, the dough is chulin. From Rabbi, and says Abai about Rabbi Eliezer's shita, Rabbi Eliezer says it depends on whatever is last. About that, lo shanu ela shekodem v'silek esa iser. When Rabbi Eliezer says that we go based on what fell in last, that is only if, say, when the chulin fell in last, the truma had already been removed. Then we'll consider it to be chulin. So it had already been removed. Now it had still kind of left an impression on the dough, but I guess whatever could have been removed was removed. Right, so it left enough of an impression that once the chulin fell in, the dough was able to rise, but I guess you removed whatever you could. I don't know. But if the truma was not removed before the chulin fell in, well then, osir, then even though the chulin fell in last, the dough is osir. So what do we see? So we see that actually when the truma and the chulin are in the dough at the same time and working together, it's zeh b'zeh goraym. The rising of the dough is being caused by both the truma and the chula. The truma and the chulin. It's zeh b'zeh goraym, and in that case we're saying taka osir. It's only mutter if the chulin fell in after the truma had already been removed. But if they're both there together, zeh b'zeh goraym is osir. So we see Rabbi Eliezer's opinion is zeh b'zeh goraym is osir. The Chacham seem to be saying zeh b'zeh goraym is mutter. That when they jointly rise the bread, it's okay. But how do we know Abai is right? Dilma, maybe maybe Rabbi Eliezer's opinion, maybe we're overcomplicating Rabbi Eliezer's opinion. Maybe it's literally as simple as whatever falls in last wins, gets the title. If the truma fell in last, it's truma. And if the chulin fell in last, it's chulin. Bein silke, bein salke, bein lo salke. Regardless of if anything was removed or not, whatever falls in last falls in. So therefore, it isn't necessarily, right? So therefore, maybe Rabbi Eliezer is saying that even if the truma was still there and then the chulin fell in last, it would still be mutter because the chulin fell in last, and he wouldn't necessarily say zeh b'zeh goraym is also. Okay, so Ella, Rabbi Eliezer Rabbanan to Eitzim. Okay, well, maybe it's Rabbi Eliezer and the Rabbanan from the Mishnah that we're going to learn in hopefully pretty soon. Yeah, this stuff's been taking a long time, but hopefully we'll get to the next Mishnahs at the top of Mem Tes Mem Beis. Hopefully we'll get there pretty soon. Rabbi Eliezer Rabbanan to Eitzim, the Snan that we learn in the Mishnah on that Mem Tes Mem Beis at the top. Not to leimena Eitzim, that if trees were taken from the Asherah tree, Asura ba'anoyo. The whatever wood was taken from the Asherah tree is osur ba'anoah. Hisig bois toner. If you use that wood to light an oven, to fire up an oven, you use Asherah wood to fire up an oven, chodesh yutatz yoshan yutzon. If it was a new oven, so apparently I'm not an oven maker yet, but apparently when you have a new oven, I guess made out of clay or something, the first time you fire it up is the makeh b'patish. That's really when it gets sealed and really becomes an oven. So if it's being fired up for the first time with Asherah wood, well then the Avodah Zarah gets baked in to the walls of the oven. And then now the oven itself is Avodah Zarah. Every single time it's fired up, even with mutter wood, there's going to be a contribution of Avodah Zarah coming from the walls of the oven. And if it was already a baked oven, right? So therefore, firing up the Avodah Zarah, firing up the oven won't like bake in the Avodah Zarah into the walls, but still you have to wait for the oven to cool down before baking any bread with it. Okay. Now what happens if you baked bread, right? So let's say it was a new oven. So mamish, the Avodah Zarah was baked into the walls of the oven, and then you subsequently baked a bread with mutter wood, but that bread will be baked with mutter wood, but in osur oven. Alternatively, if it's an older oven and the oven itself is mutter, but the wood you're using is Avodah Zarah wood, the point is we're creating a scenario of zev goraym, that the bread is being baked by mutter factors and osur factors. Hapas asura ba'ano, so the bread is osur ba'ano. So you can't get benefit from this bread. Nesavi b'acherim kulan asuris ba'ano, and if this bread gets mixed with others, they're all osur ba'ano. Rabbi Eliezer Omer Yolach Anoy Li'am HaMelech. Rabbi Eliezer says what you could do is you could take the value. So the machlokes Rashi and Tosfos is about what value. Rashi says take the value of the wood. So let's say you're burning Avodah Zarah wood. So take the value of that wood and throw it into the Dead Sea. That, you know, even when you sell the bread, you won't be getting the benefit from the value of the wood. Tosfos says the value of that bread, right? So let's say you have there's one bread that got mixed together with 10 breads, and you want to sell all 10 of them. So the value of one of the breads you have to throw into the Dead Sea. That you're not getting the value of that bread ultimately. Okay, but short of doing that, short of disposing of any benefit you'd be getting from that bread or from the wood, it would be osur. So here we have this bread that was zev goraym, whether it's the oven and the wood. Well, in both cases, the oven and the wood. No, yes. But if the question is the oven, if it's new, so the oven's osur, the wood's mutter. If it's old, then the wood's osur, the oven's mutter. Whatever it is, you have this bread that's zev goraym. And we're saying, according to Rabbi Eliezer, so long as you haven't been molech hana li'am HaMelech, it's osur. Zev goraym is osur. The Rabbanan, at least the Rabbanan in the context of Rabbi Eliezer in our Mishnah, are saying you can't just do that. So they seem to be even more stringent than Rabbi Eliezer is. But everyone in that Mishnah seems to be assuming zev goraym is osur. Rabbanan the pliga le Rabbi Eliezer manenu. Okay, fine. So if we're saying that Rabbi Eliezer is the one who's saying that by Avodah Zarah zev goraym is osur, and therefore we want to say that going back to our brises, right? When you have the fertilizer on the field, and when you use fatternizer, that's Avodah Zarah. One brise said mutter, another brise said osur. So if we want to say that the brise says osur is Rabbi Eliezer, well then we want to say it's machlokes Rabbi Eliezer and the Rabbanan. Rabbi Eliezer is the one who says osur, so the Rabbanan therefore must be the ones who say mutter. Who are these rabbis? Rabbanan. Rabbanan the pliga le Rabbi Eliezer. So the rabbis who argue with Rabbi Eliezer and are the authors of the brisa who say that the field and the cows are mutter. Maninu, who are they? Ilim Rabbanan de Eitzim. If it's the rabbis from the bread that we were just talking about, they were even more stringent than he was. Achmuri machri, they're even more stringent than he was. They were saying you can't even take its value to the Am HaMelech. El Rabbanan desor. Okay, well maybe it's the rabbis from the truma and the chulin starters that fell into the dough, and they said so long as there isn't a shear of truma, it's mutter. What about zev goraym? That seems to be mutter, but maybe that they'll say that by challah. They'll say that by truma, which is a big deal, but It's not as big of a deal as Avodah Zarah. Avodah Zarah is like a league of its own. So okay, fine. By dough, they said zev zagorim is mutter, but would they say that by Avodah Zarah zev zagorim mutter? We don't know that. So rather, we're going back to our original suggestion that, you know what, we have evidence to say that Rav Yossi holds zev zagorim is mutter. Rav Yossi says zev zagorim is mutter by orla. Rav Yossi had said zev zagorim is mutter by shochek v'zor la ruach. We had explained that maybe it's holach libud, but be'etzim, if we say Rav Yossi says zev zagorim is mutter even by Avodah Zarah, then that's just another example of he's not concerned because zev zagorim is mutter. And therefore we want to say that, you know what, and also Rav Yossi says zev zagorim is mutter by the cow and the fatternizer and the fertilizer and all that stuff. It's all Rav Yossi. You know what, Rav Yossi says zev zagorim is mutter. I don't care if it's orla, I don't care if it's Avodah Zarah. He says zev zagorim is mutter. Well, then how do we explain our Mishnah? Why is Rav Yossi saying in our Mishnah that you can't plant vegetables under an asherah tree even in the winter? It sounds like he's saying zev zagorim is osur. So in our Mishnah, Rabbi Yossi was not saying his own opinion. No, Rabbi Yossi says zev zagorim is mutter. And therefore Rabbi Yossi says if you want to plant these vegetables underneath the asherah tree in the winter, and it's going to be benefiting from the compost of Avodah Zarah, Rabbi Yossi says, look, as far as I'm concerned, zev zagorim is mutter even by Avodah Zarah. However, according to you, the Rabbanan, I don't understand how you could be saying that it's mutter. You say zev zagorim is osur. So this should also be osur. So Adidi, zev zagorim is mutter. He says, look, according to me, zev zagorim is mutter. I had no problem planting the vegetables under the asherah tree during the winter. But according to you, the mitzvah zev zagorim osur, that your opinion is that zev zagorim is osur, then odu li mias after yirakas b'mosagashanan. That vegetables being planted under an asherah tree, even in the winter, where they're going to benefit from the compost of the leaves, should be also for Rabbanan Kedamer, Rav Meir B'Yedei of Kahana. But the Rabbanan would say, like Rav Meir B'Yedei of Kahana had said, by the hide and the meat, that any benefit to the hide will be canceled out by the damage to the meat. Here also, so this is not. So they argue this isn't actually zev zagorim because any benefit caused by the compost will be canceled out by the shade provided by the asherah in the wintertime. Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel halacha Rav Yossi, says Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel that the halacha is taka like Rav Yossi, that I guess zev zagorim is mutter, even by Avodah Zarah. Interesting. How ginsod is double bezivla davidis kuchom. There was a garden that was fertilized with a fertilizer of Avodah Zarah. Shalach Rav Amram kamed Rav Yosef. So Rav Am sent before Rav Yosef to find out, what do we do? Is it mutter? Is it osur? Amalei? And Rav Yosef responds, Hachi Am Rav Yehuda Am Shmuel halacha Rav Yossi. Well, Rav Yehuda said the name of Shmuel that halacha is like Rav Yossi. Not to worry, the field is fine. Okay, so now we get up to the next Mishnah at the top of Daf Mem Testament Beis. We already learned this Mishnah. I think this should go actually maybe pretty quickly. Natam mimena eitzim asurin ba'anoyam. So if wood was taken from the asherah tree, the wood is asur ba'ano. Esik boines atoner. If you use the wood to fire up an oven, imchodesh yutas v'myoshon yutzon. If it's a new oven, and therefore the Avodah Zarah wood is being heated and baked into the walls, it has to be destroyed, the oven, v'myoshon yutzon. And if it is an older oven, you have to let it cool down. Ofa b'sapas. If you baked a bread, which is zev zagorim asura ba'anoya, it is asur ba'ano. Nis'arva b'acheres kulan asur is ba'ano. If it got mixed with others, then they're all asur ba'ano. Eliezer Omer says, Eliezer yolech hanoi li'amamelech. Well, a solution is you could take the value. We saw Machlokes Rashi and Tosfos. Let's go with Tosfos. I think it's a little bit easier to understand. That you take the value of one of the loaves of bread, and you will take that and throw it into the Dead Sea, i.e. don't get any benefit. So long as you threw any potential benefit from that bread away, well then you can sell. So then you can sell at least all of them together. Or but I think at this point, even individually, you could sell it meaning once you've thrown that value away. Amrullah, they said to him, "Ein pigeon avodas kochavim," to which they responded, "No, you can't do that. Once avodas kochavim, always avodas kochavim, the whole mixture is messed up." Okay. Notal a mena karkur, if he took from the Asherah tree a weaving pick. Also, I have the noise-canceling headphones in, but I could feel when the power washers are outside. It's mamish, it's probably like 4 or 5 in the afternoon. I don't even know. But they drive they drive this like dinky little power washer mobile. You feel the whole neighborhood shake. So while I can't hear it, I feel it. Anyways, that's how in the morning I don't, even before the power washers come, I'm like a cat or something. What is like really good senses? Like I feel it from a mile away. It's like, oh no, the power washers are getting closer, so I know to put in my noise canceling headphones before they get here. So if they took from the Asherah tree, not imena karkur, took from the Asherah tree a weaver's pick, also bano, that weaver's pick is Osir ba'ana, came from an Asherah tree. Arag bo'as a beged, if the weaver's pick was used to weave a garment, Osir ba'anoya, that garment is going to be Osir ba'anoya. Nisai b'achirim. Okay, so taka toisis, we're not going to get into it. We got to move. But there's taka toisis on Daf Mem Tesam Aleph who says leave out. Is Rabbeinu Tam, I think he says leave out achirim. So we will. So if the garment got mixed with others, kulan asuris. So meaning leave out achirim, just nisar b'achirim, if it got mixed with others, kulam asuris ba'anoya, they're all also ba'anoya. But Eliezer omer yolach hanoya le'amamelech. But Eliezer says take the value. I imagine it's probably also the same machlokes about the value of the pick versus the value of the garment. Where are we? And throw that value into the Dead Sea. Amrullah, they said to him in pigeon avodas kochavim, you can't. You have to leave it, and it's all osir. Tzricha, we needed both cases. We needed the case of the bread as well as the case of the weaver's pick. If we'd only have the case of the bread, so maybe in that case, Rabbi Eliezer says, okay, you can be poda, just take the value, throw it into the Dead Sea, and you're good. Rabbi Eliezer says there, it's okay, because at the time that the bread was finished baking, whatever wood was used to bake it has already experienced a chemical reaction and is gone. But by the weaver's pick, where the weaver's pick still exists, maybe you would say, okay, you can't just throw the value to the Dead Sea in that case. If we only had the case of the pick, this is where the rabbis respond to it, says you can't just throw the value to the Dead Sea. Have a pass. But maybe by the bread, where the wood has already been burnt and doesn't exist anymore, maybe they would agree with Rabbi Eliezer that you could throw the value into the Dead Sea and then you can get benefit. You could sell the bread. Therefore, we need both the Reisha and the Seifa to see that the machlokes between Rabbi Eliezer and the Chachamim is in both scenarios. Amar B'chia Brei de Rabbi Bar Nachmani, Amar Rav Chizda, Amar Zeiri Halacha Rabbi Eliezer, that the halacha follows Rabbi Eliezer, that you can throw the value into the Dead Sea. Ikadamar, those who say Amar Rav Chizda, Amar Li Abba, by Rav Chizda, Achi Amar Zeiri Halacha Rabbi Eliezer. Also, the halacha is like Rabbi Eliezer, they could throw the value into the Dead Sea. Amar Rav Bar Hava Leishanu Ela Pas Aval Chavis Lo. Oh, says Rav Bar Hava that we said that by bread you could throw the value into the Dead Sea, but when you have yein nesech, you have a barrel of yein nesech, that you cannot just throw the value into the Dead Sea. For Rav Chizda Amar Afilu Chavis Muteris, whereas Rav Chizda says no, even by yein nesech, throw the value to the Dead Sea, and you can then sell all of the barrels to an Oved Kuchavim. There was a person whose a barrel of yein nesech got mixed in with the rest of his barrels of wine. So the Chaim of Chizda came for Rav Chizda Amar Shkol Arba Zuzeh Ushti Benarav V'Shasi V'Nishtri Lach. So Rav Chizda says, okay, no problem. Just take 4 zuzahs, throw them into the river, and now you could sell the rest of the barrel. You could sell the barrels to an Oved Kuchavim, and any value you'd be getting from that particular barrel, you already had thrown into the river. And now to wrap up the final Mishnah of today's daf, as well as the third perek of masechta Avodah Zarah. Sheesh, this must have been a long one. Ketzad mevatel, says the Mishnah, how are you mevatel Avodah Zarah. Oh yeah, I don't forget. I don't remember what these things mean. So I'm going to pull out an article so that I could translate these thingies. Okay. So how is one mevatel the Asherah tree? Kirsem v'zeret, if he pruned or trimmed it. Okay. Natal mimena makel o sharvet afilu ole, or removed a stick, twig, or even a leaf from it. Harizo bitla, he's nullified it. Shipa letzorka, if he shaved chips from it for its own needs, well then asura, the Asherah remains asur, but I think the Asherah remains asur, but the chips I think are mutter. Shalol letzorka, but if he did it for if he did so not for his own kilu, for his own needs, probably mutaris, well then best if he's, he doesn't care about the Asherah, he only cares about himself, and it's going to be asur. Okay. He's basically saying, I don't care about the Asherah, so he's nullifying, he's being mevatel. It says the Gemara, Osun shapoyin mate elain. So in the scenario where sheshipa letzorka, right, in the scenario where he trimmed the tree in order to improve the tree, so what happens? So the tree remains asur, but what about the trimmings? Osun shapoyin mate elain. What about the trimmings? Plige ba Rav Huna v'chia barav chadam or asun v'chadam mutar. Nice clean machlokas. One opinion says the trimmings are asur. The other opinion says the trimmings are mutar. Tanya kamad mutarin. There's a Bryce like opinion that says mutar. Decided that we learned the Bryce of Chom shashipa avodas chom letzorko, that somebody who who trims an Asherah tree for his own needs, he v'shapaya mutarin. Well, then the tree is batel and the trimmings are also mutarin letzorko. But if it's to improve the tree, to make it look nice, to prune it, to trim it, well then he asur, the tree remains asur, v'shapea mutarim, but the trimmings are mutar. V'Yisrael shashipa avodas kuchavim. However, for yid, right, a yid cannot be the mevatel Avodah Zarah of an avodah kuchavim. So bein the tzorko, he v'shapea asur. I don't care what the motives for the yid doing the trimming was, whether to destroy the Avodah Zarah, whether to improve it, makes no difference. The Avodah Zarah remains asur, as do its trimmings. Itmar was stated avodas kuchavim. When you have Avodah Zarah that breaks on its own, so Rav says you have to be mevatel every single shard. Whereas Shmuel says that Avodah Zarah can only become batel by the way that it grows. Let's go back for a second. It should be the opposite. Does it become batel when it's derech kedei lasa? That derech kedei lasa we saw, I don't even know if it's recently anymore, maybe a week ago, 2 weeks ago, that, for example, when you have the tree, like we've been talking about it, right, there with the tree that you plant the vegetables under the Asherah tree during the winter, and we're saying that the leaves fall down and create compost. So when the leaves, so if a Avodah Zarah, an idol, falls down and shatters into a million pieces, so then, yeah, it's batel, right? It couldn't even protect itself. But says Shmuel, a scenario where you have a tree that its leaves are falling off, that's derech kedei lasa. That's normal. It's natural. That's not being mevatel the Asherah, and you would still need to be, right? It's still going to be asur. So again, so let's read that again. Right, so Ushmuel Omar says Shmuel avodas kuchavim eina betela era ela derech kedei lasa, to which the Gemara is going to ask on that. Right, but Shmuel says an Asherah is going to be batel when it sheds naturally. Adrabah, we need the opposite. When it's shedding naturally, it's still an Asherah tree. This is what it's saying. If it sheds naturally, well then you would still have to be mevatel the Asherah tree because it's still asur. It was only shedding naturally. Let's say at the machlokes between Rav, that's between Rav, who says you have to be mevatel every shard because it's still Avodah Zarah, and Shmuel, who says that it's batel, right? Because as long as it wasn't natural, it's batel. So then let's say that the machlokas is the Marsavar Ovdin the Shvarim, Marsavar ain't Ovdin the Shvarim. That Rav says Ovdin the Shvarim, that they're still going to worship the shards. Whereas Shmuel says, no, they are not going to worship the shards. No, the Chuliyama Ovdin Lishvarim. No, everybody agrees that they will worship the shards. Now, Taka, that's interesting because Shmuel's opinion earlier in the perek was that Avodah Zarah, he and Reish Lakish agreed that Avodah Zarah is asur, is mutar. the Avodah Zarah Shnei there is mutter, so they don't worship the shards. Whatever Rashi Tosfos is going to explain, so how do you explain it? But let's just go weiter at this point. Okay, so Shmuel is, so we're saying both, everybody agrees that they do worship the shards. But the machlokes is, what about when it breaks into a million pieces, and then those a million pieces break into a million pieces? That's like a gazillion pieces. So Marsover Shivrei Shvarim Asurin. So Rav says even a gazillion pieces are asur. Marsover Shivrei Shvarim Mutarin, where Shmuel says no, at that point they are permitted. By same alternatively, the Chuli Ama Shivrei Shvarim Mutarin. Everybody agrees that a gazillion pieces would be mutar. Here we are talking about Avodah Zarah that's made up of lots of little small pieces that you can construct. And anybody can just, a regular person can put it back together. Rav says since a regular person can reconstruct it, it is not batel. Whereas Shmuel says, look, the only time where you have to be mevatel avodah, the only time where it remains avodah zarah, when you have to be mevatel it still, is when the avodah zarah naturally fell apart, like the leaves of a tree falling off. But here, this is an avodah zarah that fell to the ground and broke into a bunch of pieces. And even though, yes, a regular person can reconstruct it, but it did fall on the floor and break, it's already considered batel as far as Shmuel is concerned. That is the end of today's daf, as well as the end of the third perek of masechta Avodah Zarah. Sheesh, I don't know quite how long that daf was. I think today was a long one, but we did look at some really interesting stuff. Zev goraym, mutter or asur, really the sugya of zev goraym took up a lot of our focus today, which is a super interesting sugya. There was a very interesting analysis of Tosfos about how to define zev goraym, that it's when it's apples to apples, not apples to oranges, whereas Rashi seems to be okay with apples to oranges, which was interesting. And so that really took up the main, I think our main focus today. Be'etzem, Rabbi Yossi says zev goraym is mutter across the board. The Chacham says zev goraym is asur. Then we talked about Avodah Zarah mixtures. We saw the interesting opinion of Rabbi Eliezer that you could take the value of, let's say, the bread or the weaver's pick, or we then talked about wine barrels. You can take the value of the mixture and throw the value into the Yamamela, which is interesting. That was Rabbi Eliezer's opinion, and it seems from the Gemara that we paskin that way. And then we at the end talked about how to be mevatel and asherah. That was daf mem tes of masechta Avodah Zarah. I hope you enjoyed. Peace out.